Well, good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be, and welcome to the Women in Shared Mobility, Addressing Gender Gaps in Public Transportation and Public Spaces. This is a great subject for any time, but especially during Women's History Month, and especially when the COVID pandemic and the last year's focus on all kinds of equity issues has really brought more attention to this subject. I'm Ellen Partridge. I'm the Policy and Strategy Director at the Shared Use Mobility Center. The Shared Use Mobility Center promotes shared mobility, shared assets like car sharing and scooter sharing and bike sharing, and we promote shared journeys, where public transit is the backbone, but there are lots of others in supporting roles. And the reason we do this is because it promotes both equity and sustainability. So that is the Shared Use Mobility Center. I would have to say though, so we think we get to equity and sustainability, but only if we're really conscious about it. And so we strive to do that. Today we have a highly accomplished panel. We have creators of policy and the creator of an organization. So let me give you a quick introduction, and then the folks will introduce themselves, and then we'll get into a discussion of several important issues. So Kim Lucas is with the City of Pittsburgh, where she is the Assistant Director of Pittsburgh Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. She oversees policy planning and permitting. And Pittsburgh is one of the few places that actually has a Department of Mobility. And so I'll be interested to hear more about what that means. Marla Westervelt is the Director of Policy at the Commission on the Future of Mobility. She describes herself as a transportation wonk and technology enthusiast, and she will tell us more about the commission, which has just been created within the last few months. And it seems like it has a really important role to fill. And we have Candice Xie, the founder of VIO, a startup that provides all kinds of micromobility services. And she'll tell us about founding the company, the whys and wherefores. But why don't we start with reverse alphabetical order and introducing yourself. So Candice.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Ellen, for the intro, and thanks for inviting me here. My name is Candice Shit. I'm the co-founder and also CEO for VIO. VIO is a Chicago-based micromobility company, and our goal is to provide safe, accessible, and sustainable transportation to cities across the nation. And as Ellen mentioned, we do have a portfolio of modes of transportation that we provide. For example, bike share, electric bike, and also stand-up scooter, city scooter, and more, and in order to meet everyone's needs.
Marla?
Hello, my name is Marla Westervelt, and I am the Director of Policy for the Commission on the Future of Mobility, which is a brand new commission that was just launched last month. We are a global coalition of businesses, technology, and policy leaders, all focusing on implementing new approaches to sustainable and equitable movement of people and goods around the world. We are still in our incubation process, and we would love to start conversations with anyone who's interested in some of the same topics.
That sounds so exciting. All right, Kim, tell us about Pittsburgh and what you're doing there.
Yes, hi, Kim Lucas. As you heard, I'm with the city's Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. We are one of the newest, if not the newest, city departments for the city of Pittsburgh. We were formed about 4 years ago formally, and we combined positions and work that had been previously living in the Department of Public Works and the Department of City Planning, and we added to it. I heard the question about mobility. We are not a Department of Transportation per se, but that was because we knew that the physical mobility, so the transportation aspect, is what is needed to help people with social and economic mobility. And so we want to make sure that our department is comprehensive in addressing the needs of our residents and visitors.
So there was no Department of Transportation as a predecessor?
No.
Oh, interesting. Well, then you're very much in the 21st century. So let's start talking about the impact of COVID on women and what the mobility industry should be doing about it. So COVID really has had a disproportionate impact on women, with many more women leaving the workforce at twice the rate of men. It's the reasons for that are many, but childcare and other kinds, teaching. People now have to be teachers, not just caregivers. So lots more burdens fall on women, although I understand even still that men are doing housework, domestic duties at about twice the rate of what they did before. So there's a lot more activity by everyone, but in the outside the home workforce, women have had a much harder time. Women make up about 2/3 of what are called essential workers. Lots of that is in the restaurant and hospitality industry, which has been really, really hard hit. So the opportunities for them getting back in the workforce are also troublesome. And on public transit, the percentage of women has actually gone up. So not the total number, but the percentage of women using public transit in many cities has actually gone up. And women have lots of unique transit issues, even during the pandemic. So in one transit survey, a woman said, "I take my kids to the doctor some mornings, then bring them to school before I go to work. Later, I help my mother buy groceries and bring my kids home on the metro." So we have those kinds of issues. Issues of fairness have a new resonance in a world in which this pandemic and racial justice protests have elevated conversations around essential workers, public space, and equity policies. So Marla is going to get us started with talking about how the pandemic has highlighted women's needs and what we might do about it. Marla.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. So women have always had different needs than men when it comes to transportation, and our transportation systems have never really been built around our needs. But we've been inside for over a year now, and the pandemic has made some of those needs that we have that aren't always addressed a little bit more acute. So I'm interested in hearing, what needs have been highlighted through this experience that may have existed before. And what do we do to better address women's needs in the mobility industry?
Kim, would you like to take a crack at that?
Sure. So it's kind of interesting to hear that the public transportation trips taken by women have doubled, when also a number of women have left the workforce at a higher rate than men. So I'm actually really curious. Oh, did I mishear that?
The percentage of women on the buses has increased.
Oh.
It hasn't doubled. So it seems like still more women on buses than men, and transit generally. Yeah. So no, that would be a really extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I think the interesting thing is just looking at many things about COVID. It's trends have been accelerated that were already underway. So telework was already underway and has been accelerated. Public transit, let's think about how has that been impacted.
Well, I think what we've seen generally from public transit ridership, and at least these were some of the patterns that were highlighted at the very beginning of the shutdown, is that most of the ridership was reduced to those who were perhaps transit dependent. So no longer did you have the folks who maybe had, a privilege of employment where they could do their job 100% from their home, but you also had people who maybe they took transit for whatever reasons. They had subsidized transit trips. It was more convenient. It was a little more affordable. They still need to go in, but they own a car. So I think one of the most telling tales, and especially if we're talking about an increase in specifically women, is just highlighting that is more of the transit dependent population, and focusing efforts on figuring out how to make those trips better. So just because someone can get from point A to point B on a bus doesn't mean that it was convenient. It doesn't mean that it was fast. It doesn't mean I wasn't the only person whose Zoom just went away, was I?
No, I also jumped off.
It's a system issue that people are furiously working on.
Well, shall we jump back in, Kim?
Yeah, I'm looking at the participant number as it keeps going up, but mostly what I was saying was that what we've seen is that the people for whom public transit was a choice on how they got around, left it when it was not the best choice for them anymore. And so if we're seeing an increase in the percentage of women that are riding transit, then we know it's because it's less of a choice for them. And so focusing in on that group, on how our transit system is operating, not only the destinations, the frequency, the accessibility of it. You know, as I was saying, and again, it's always fun to have the curtain pulled right when you're in the middle of a sentence, but using this as an opportunity to really identify who's dependent on our transit system the most, and talking to them and finding out how it might not be working and how it might work better. You know, this is an unprecedented time. This is a catalyst for doing things a different way, because all of a sudden we've been forced into an environment where revenues dramatically changed, where ridership has dramatically changed, and where people's lives and their commutes and their daily trip needs will probably never be the same. And so taking this as an opportunity to talk to the folks that are going to be there and that are going to need our services, I think is one that we should take.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely right. And I think it also kind of reinforces the flaw that we have in urban planning of optimizing for that 9 to 5 commute. And those have, you know, for jobs that are able to work from home, gone away. But all the other things that people need to do, and particularly women and caretakers need to do, those things are still there, and those things are always going to be there. And so, yeah, I think you're right. It's just such a wonderful opportunity to start to figure out how to plan for that and how to deliver real services for that. Ellen, do you have anything else to add, or Candice, if you're on the line?
Yes, sorry about that. I'm not sure how I got dropped, and if someone can enable my video, that would be appreciated. And I think that the item I have in my mind is actually safety, like personal safety from the transportation side, because during COVID and like measures like social distancing and also lockdown have led to a very significant reduction in public transit use, and the decreased number of people who using the public transit, and also the number of bystander support in those public transit systems actually resulted in highlighting risk of violence against women. I think that part is very important, because women right now not only need to face the fear of the COVID spread, the virus, and also need to be more concerned about the personal safety, especially at night when they're choosing to use public transportation. And that also lead to the lack of service, for the lack of access to safe transport modes will also result in the lack of access to job and also services. That can also further increase the gap for gender equality.
Well, we seem to have a technological problem here for briefly. I don't know, Candice, are you on?
She's able to talk. I don't think she has a video right now.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, it really is a brave new world. So one of the things I wanted to say about how public transit has changed, which says a lot about the workforce, is that what used to be peaks in the morning and peaks in the afternoon, I mean, really peaks, you know, are now much more like rolling hills. So, but the impact of that on transit agencies is that the costs are really spread out very differently. And so figuring out how to plan in the future. So are we going to go back to having those peaks, or should we think more about these rolling hills continuing? And for essential workers, people who work shifts that are not the 9 to 5, it's important to have more frequent service at more times of the day. So rather than concentrating all your capital and workforce at those 2 peaks between 7 and 9, or whatever the peak is in your particular city, and then 3 and 6. It's much more, it provides better service for people who are essential workers if you have more regular service, more frequent service throughout the day and night. So
I
can we
think it's
talk about,
sorry to cut in. I think it's better for everybody when you have more frequent service throughout the day and night. And that's why
yes,
so many people don't use transit, is because it doesn't work for them. Even when you work those normal commute hours, if you miss, if you're in the extreme case where there's a few buses in the morning and there's a few buses in the evening that serve your neighborhood and would take you to your destination, you have one bad morning or one late call at the office and it doesn't work for you anymore. And I know with the Guaranteed Ride Home program, which has been around for many years at this point, there are programs in place. And I know that with TNC options and ride sharing options and scooters and bikes and everything else, that there are options. But I think a theme for this whole session is when you plan for the most vulnerable users and the most vulnerable groups, you end up with a better system for all of your users and all of your groups, that this is an opportunity to really make some changes because it's an unprecedented time.
and so, yeah, what kind of opportunities is that going to create? And are we really going to be able to re-envision how our system works? There's an opinion writer for the New York Times who in this morning's paper has an homage to buses, about how if we just look more at having frequent buses and clean buses and shiny buses, that will go a long way to providing more service for more people. But it is clearly dependent on those buses being able to move through traffic. And the way that happens is through dedicated lanes. So that requires a really re-envisioning of how we look at our streets, so that, the streets, which are so built for cars, that we can look at how, what's the throughput? How do we get people through? And how do we make it more equitable so that you don't have to own a car, you don't have to pay for parking at those 2 or 3 different places where you traverse to get places. So I think there is an opportunity. Other comments on the special needs of women before we turn to another subject?
Yeah, so Alan, just to pick on what you just mentioned, I think there are opportunity for local leaders and transportation authority to create spaces for women and girls to participate in the transportation strategies. For example, right now, many cities has opted in to develop alternative or active transportation infrastructure. For example, like creating temporary or long-term bike lanes. One example you just mentioned is actually New York. In New York, the number of women biking surged like 150% in July 2020 compared to the same months in 2019. So that tells me the government, they're moving, but I think we can expect more. And there's result already showing in different cities already.
So an unexpected benefit that was not even anticipated. So let's talk about women in the transportation workforce and in the transportation sort of processes. So one of the things that always comes up is, how do decisions get made? And if you have more women who are in the workforce, then women's viewpoints are going to be represented more, or if you have more opportunities for public meetings that are set up in a way that women can more readily attend, then you have more things that are built for women. And we have the kind of extreme example, which I just learned, that there were no female dummies were not used in the crash testing until actually the 21st century, not 20 years ago do we start using female dummies. And so it wasn't just a question of having sort of small, medium, and large dummies. The actual proportions and makeup are different. And so one of the impacts was that when there were crashes using the female dummies and the male dummies, they have different kind of whiplash representations because of the way the whole body is put together. So something that you wouldn't necessarily think of if you were just using kind of small, medium, and large. From a physiological to a perceptual dimension, there is reason to have lots of voices in the room. So Kimberly is going to talk to us about women in the workforce.
Well, I'm a fan of having women in the workforce, obviously. And I have the pleasure of, the director of the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure is Karina Ricks. So we are a department that has women represented in the highest ranks of leadership, which I think does offer the opportunity and the potential to bring in the perspective that has for many years, we're a new department, so I can't say for our department, but for many departments historically were led by men, of course, just like many leadership positions in many different industries. I think it's twofold, though. I think that just by virtue of being a woman or just by virtue of being of a different demographic, if you're trained and socialized a certain way, if you're educated in a certain system, you may still approach problems or only identify problems the way that you've been trained to think about them. And so I think one of the things that's really important is to give space when women are in the workforce and in these positions, give us the space to think about things with our own approach and to be able to maybe deviate from the way something has been done previously, which is it's a hard thing to do, especially, we're talking about public transportation in the previous question. Oftentimes because of constraints of resources, you have to follow the path of least resistance. You might not have the time, you might not have the finances to do something in an innovative way. And so it's not only having people at the table, both on the side of the people working, but also of who you're engaging that are diverse in their voices, but it's also making sure that the systems that they're working within are going to listen. But yeah, as I've already said, and I'll say it again, planning and including the most vulnerable population, and as Candice was saying, women are typically more vulnerable from a safety perspective. We're perhaps more vulnerable, as you heard, that more women are riding public transportation and therefore dependent on public transit and probably working in healthcare or other essential positions. So probably vulnerable, not only from a health perspective, but also from an economic perspective. And just from the standpoint of having more likely to have the kids with you in a stroller or to have to run errands for the whole family and that kind of thing. So having outsized needs for an individual in terms of the transportation needs. And so it's critical that you have people who have lived that life on the side of making decisions, but they also need to be in an environment that is open to them.
Yeah, I think to build on that, my experience of working in a public transit agency was that when I brought new ideas from my female perspective, they were often not heard in a really constructive way because they were a different perspective. I often also found that I was the only person that was a woman in the room and that I needed men to amplify my voice, which, I am someone in a position of privilege and I still experience that issue at the institutional level. And then I think that you're right, that creating a space that allows people to kind of share their perspectives and fears away from how we've thought about transportation for decades is challenging, but a critical foundational step.
And it does seem like we're reevaluating transportation in so many ways. We've designed our highway system, our road system, our street system around cars. And now in the last few years, we've been seeing that, that doesn't actually work for all people, and you can't build your way out of congestion, all that. So I think that our new administration is also taking a really, really hard and good look at how do we change the system? How do we think about allocating funds differently? How do we think about having different voices come in? And the voices of women are certainly important. I just read about a town in Sweden where when they invited people in to talk about their snow plowing activities and budget, that they found that more women use sidewalks. And so they actually switched around using the snowplow money for sidewalks first before cars. And as a resident of Chicago, I would be happy to have the city take over the responsibility of shoveling sidewalks. I can't see that happening anytime soon, but one can always hope. But I think that you don't know what perspective you're missing until you actually hear what the world looks like from somebody else's shoes. So yeah, and it has to be sort of a variety of people with different abilities, people from different neighborhoods, people with different family situations, with different income issues. So lots of voices that need to come in. Candice, you wanna add in?
Yeah, one thing I do echo what Marla just said is that we are underrepresented and we don't have enough seat on the table. And that actually we need to do more at this stage in order to pave a better way for women in the future. For example, not only women are like underrepresented in like public transportation design, and also very much in different area in life, for example, in tech space. So for example, a lot of technology solutions are created for women, but not created by women. I think recently I have become perfectly comfortable with saying this technology doesn't work and or work for me as a woman or work for me as a woman of color. And since you didn't include me in this technology or service we designed, so we need to fix it and understand that kind of conversation is not ideal interaction to have every day, but that's our importance because we're fighting for women to be seen as equals at the ground floor of technology or service we build together.
I think your bicycling example was so interesting to say that the number of women has really gone up. Let's see, someone just says they can't see us all on Zoom.
Looks like,
All right.
oh, remove spotlight is an option. Maybe if I click that. Now can you see whoever's talking? Person in chat land.
Okay, well,
Oh,
all right.
that worked.
Something worked. Okay. So let's see, where were we? We're having more voices at the table, and the bicycle example in New York City. So do we know more about why there were more women bicyclists? Is it the lack of traffic makes it more compatible for women? Certainly, we know that the number of men bicyclists is just far greater than for women.
So from a private sector operator perspective, based on the user we surveyed, we find out like women and also people, they feel like micromobility, like bicycle, like e-scooter, it's a pretty natural way of keeping social distancing and not to be in a room with all others. So I think that might contribute to the trend we're seeing here. And with the New York better bike infrastructure system build out, that's more inviting because people are feeling safer on the road instead of sharing the road with the cars.
From your perspective in providing bicycles and other micromobility devices, what would you like to see cities do as we move out of the pandemic era?
Well, I think that this has been a great opportunity. I saw at the beginning of the pandemic when the weather was better and we're getting into that good weather season in Pittsburgh again, that people who I can best describe as like they had their bike in the back of the garage and they used to take it out once a summer for recreation. They were now using it on streets and probably also for recreation, but perhaps at a much higher frequency because they couldn't go to the movies, they couldn't go out to eat. And this was something that they could do when everything else was shut down. So I think now we have a ton of people who can help advocate for better bicycle infrastructure and to have more dedicated spaces where they can feel comfortable riding in more places. And so I think the pandemic has offered that. It has enabled us to find more people that might be on our side. we are a final mile city, which means that we are in the process of rapidly implementing a big portion of our bicycle master plan that we published last year. And so we're trying to rapidly implement miles and miles of infrastructure. And so I think it is kind of an interesting time to be doing any major changes to your streets or any planning exercises, certainly, because this is a weird time. We don't know what it's going to look like in a couple of years. But I do think that having, in the instances where there are less people driving, this is a great opportunity to make that shift of how that space is being used. I don't know if that's totally the case everywhere, though, because a lot of people, again, as I mentioned earlier, they're discretionary riders on public transit, and there are people who either got to stay home and work from home, or there are people who chose to drive to their places of employment. And I think what we've seen in a lot of communities is car trips are back up to where they were before the pandemic, even though a lot of people are at home still. So what's that about? So to summarize, having spaces where people feel comfortable to ride, because you might not have seen a lot of these folks in the middle of the street had it not been that cars were down for a little while. So how do we use that momentum to build out permanent infrastructure that can provide a similar experience?
Yeah,
It-
to build
yeah.
to build on that, when I worked in micromobility, and micromobility was, the hot thing at the time, everyone would say, how has micromobility changed the way we think about urban planning? And I would say, well, it gives us more opportunity to do the things that we've been advocating for decades. We still need to invest in bike lanes. We still need to do this. Let's use this momentum. And I think, you're right that COVID further amplifies that. And it's trying to take this moment of political opportunity where we can test out things and ideally make them permanent where possible.
Yeah, it is seizing the moment, and the good things that have come out of it. I think we probably all have a list of things we want to do after the pandemic, and some things that we want to keep that developed during the pandemic. So I think in the transportation space, having more opportunities for bicycling, thinking more about transit serving throughout the 24-hour period with more frequent service, rather than being so focused on the peak hours. And the same trend is that people were teleworking before the pandemic, and they're doing it a lot more now. And we're not quite sure where that's going to land. Is it going to be people want to work at the office 2 days a week or 3 days a week, or who knows what? But the transportation system can help sort of define how that works as well. So Marla, is your commission looking at activities that might sort of accelerate some of the trends that are developing during the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the role of the commission is to kind of take a longer view on what we want the future of mobility to look like and how we get there. And a lot of that is, of course, capturing some of these trends and taking this moment along with trends that we see in the future to say, let's build out that infrastructure we've been talking about, and here's how to do this.
Are there any events that you want to highlight for us that the commission has on the calendar, or is it too soon?
Well, with kicking off about 3 weeks ago, we are still creating our story, but we do hope to be having events starting this summer where we can be convening folks to be having these conversations in a meaningful way.
We should also talk a little bit about how to encourage more women into the transportation workforce. So even when I worked at the Department of Transportation for a number of years, and the participation of women was far less than for men, even at a government agency where women tend to have more opportunities, at least in the past. But again, there was a very different kind of percentage of women in places like the FTA, where there were lots of women, than in more technologically oriented parts of the agency. So really the emphasis on STEM and women getting that kind of encouragement early on to work in technological fields is very important. Candice, so nice to see you. This is a little comedy of errors from the visual perspective. So Candice, tell us. So you were a founder, created this organization. Tell us how that came about.
Of course. So we started roughly like 4 years ago, and we saw the opportunity in micromobility, and a lot of people are not served and hard to figure out the last mile transportation. So that's the reason why we jump in. And over the years, we also find out the quality of the service on both the product and also the operation side is not strong enough. So that's the reason why I think we were focusing a lot more on how we're able to provide a safe product on the street, because people are putting their life on it. And over the last 2 years, the more focus on us is on accessibility. So the reason why accessibility is important at our current stage is actually during the Chicago pilots, we provide stand-up scooter for the city. And in our user database, we do find out 60 to 65% of riders are men. And that incentivize us to actually dive into our user base, especially the community who don't use our product, and get the feedback from women and also from the elderly who are like underrepresented in our like user base. And we got the feedback like professional women, they typically wear heels to work. So stand-up scooter would be very difficult. And a lot of people also need to get groceries and also need to pick up kids. So like stand-up scooter, it's very challenging for them and to fulfill the usage of like the last mile transportation. So we actually got inspired and rolled out our city scooter last year. And it's extremely popular in Atlanta. And we are rolling out more city this year. And that will be our focus, because city scooter is not the end goal. And there are more product to meet more goal, and the usage from women or from the elderly or other unrepresented like groups in the community, like Kim mentioned earlier. So I think that is one thing, one journey, and one focus we'll be working on. And it takes time, it takes conversation, but I think we are on the right track.
So you're also in conversation with the makers, with the manufacturers, to tell them the kinds of needs that you are identifying and what product might be needed to help meet those needs.
Correct. We actually vertically integrate with our manufacturing. So we're able to make like small adjustment over time, over different batches, to make sure it's improved over time very quickly. We don't need to wait until we deploy all the 100,000 purchase before like the others in order to do improvement on our existing program.
Did you find that women are using scooters more with the streets being more open, as well as using bicycles more?
I would say women are using like city scooter more. And with the bicycle lane more open, we did see like an uptick for the stand-up scooter population usage, but not like a huge jump like the bicycle.
You know what this is sort of like calling to mind for me, and probably in main part, and this kind of goes back to making sure that people have lots of different variables that they're representing. I have a child now who is almost 4 months old. And for nearly 7 years, I managed Capital Bike Share and helped bring dockless bikes and scooters to Washington, D.C., and did micromobility. And when the Capital Bike Share had a pretty good split, but 50-50, very close to 50-50 for women in using our bikes. We never asked them, do you have a kid? We never asked them, are you, we asked on our annual survey, what type of trips do you use this for? But we haven't actually had a box, and we could ask this of men too, do you have children? And If yes, would you want to be able to use this service? I know for a while there were different, there was something that people called a kitty, what was it? Point being, someone invented a seat that you could clamp onto the front of a bike share bike and have your child ride a bike share bike with you. And they were getting popular about 6 years ago in DC. And we had to stop that. We had to say that is unsafe. You're not allowed to modify our bikes in any way. This is not okay. But when you have things like that bubble up organically, to Candice's point about underrepresented folks, like it's not just about having someone who identifies as a woman using your service, it's about having different folks with different needs in their lifestyles. And are we asking the right questions when we're talking to people? And, it is one thing to talk to your users. It's another thing to find out from the general public who aren't using your service why they're not using your service. I remember when e-scooters had launched in DC, some people said that women were more likely to use e-scooters because they don't have to hike their leg over a bike, if they're wearing a dress or a skirt. I was not one of those people. I'll write anything in anything, but that was a perspective that was brought forward. And so I think, we put a lot on having maybe someone who's woman identifying as bringing forward these use cases, but there are benefits to other people that will be had if we can get these other use cases out to the table.
So it's always an interesting question from the public agency perspective about how to get all the necessary participation without having a kind of paralysis of just not being able to make a decision because you haven't heard from absolutely everyone. I think that's a good argument for pilot projects. I think Pittsburgh has been very good with pilot projects. The city of Chicago has tried a couple of ways of having scooters to really see what works, what are the problems that you didn't anticipate, and to make sure that you actually measure the things that are important while you're doing the pilot, so that it doesn't just go into the great maw of unanalyzed data.
And to add to that, if you're a mom with kids and you're the breadwinner for the household and you're taking 2 buses to get to your job because you're an essential worker, are you going to have time or interest in participating in the public process to provide feedback? I think that's also one of the major hurdles that the pandemic has helped by making online engagement a possibility and by really pushing communities like Pittsburgh to have platforms that are accessible 24 hours a day with our online Engage PGH platform, and to also have a virtual meeting option so that if you have to feed your kids or you only have a little bit of time, maybe you can log on and you don't have to be there for part of it, for the whole thing rather. And so I think that some barriers have been reduced. Obviously, the digital divide means that they're now a barrier for some folks. But historically, the people that have the most interesting perspective with the most challenges that we want to try to, help are probably the people that have the least ability to participate in the public process. So how do you make it so that it's easy to get useful feedback from those folks?
And some part of that is by having data that you require private providers to give to city agencies. So in the city of Chicago, the city gets data about use of transportation network providers, Uber and Lyft, and can see how they're being used in different parts of town, how long the trips are from where to where. Are they pooled trips, and just all kinds of useful information that the city can then try to figure out, well, are there needs that are not being served that we need to take some action? And similarly, they're looking at data from the scooter companies. But yeah, with the pandemic and just how things have changed, I think that there's be a real need for the kind of analysis about trying to see what are the good things that we have about transportation that happen, and how do we keep those happening. Marla, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in on the data comment and say, while we are, able to capture a lot of big data from a lot of our private providers that can be shared with public agencies, that data of a movement of a vehicle doesn't reflect the gender of the person or the needs of the person entirely. You're only getting part of the story. And yes, there's ways to use data science to infer, but ultimately, we still need to use the same old tools we have been using of surveys and figure out better ways to maybe partner with the private sector to deliver those surveys. But that's going to really help us get that full picture where it's not simply just the movements, it's who's moving, what do they need, and who's not moving on these vehicles.
Right. And as we are more conscious of equity issues that are related to race, I think that gender issues will also be sort of more salient as we look at, like, so how are Black and brown women affected by different transportation needs, and how do we serve them? How do we serve all women? Let me turn to this question of public spaces. So we had thought that the session should cover both public transit and public spaces, which our transportation folks don't always think about, except in terms of, like, well, how do you connect the different parts of the transportation system? So we at the Shared Use Mobility Center, we want to encourage mobility hubs where you can have a bike share and a car share and a scooter share, and a place for ride-hailing vehicles, all at your bus stop and transit stop. So that's sort of our perspective on public spaces, but there is a lot more to it than that. Candice, you want to talk about public spaces a bit?
Sounds good. So from the private sector's perspective, we always want to understand what are some tools that available help us understand what are some community needs. So I have several questions for the public space or public sector. Like, for example, the first question I have is that if you have a magic wand, what is one thing you will change about how the public space is designed to better accommodate women's needs?
You're not allowed to say magic wand, because I always say magic wand, because I want people to be thinking in unconstrained ways, because we are so constrained in everything we do that I want people to be thinking of what is their fantasy. So when I don't necessarily think in terms of women, I think of people who have either devices that they need to use. So example, wheels, do you have wheels, whether it's a stroller, whether it's a wheelchair, whether it's something else? And how can we make our public space more accessible and predictable for those? So my magic wand would be physical changes to make sure that there are sidewalks everywhere. B, you can get up and down from those sidewalks in a safe and predictable way. C, when you've left the sidewalk and you need to cross the street, the crossing time is enough for you to get across, even if you're moving really slowly, because you're bringing your kids with you, because you have some other reason that you move more slowly than maybe the signal was timed for. And I know that if we had a public space that looked like that everybody would benefit from it. We talked a little bit about public security earlier. So safety being, am I going to get hit by a car? Security being, am I going to get robbed? Do I feel, not secure and unsafe in that way? So lighting, making sure that we had adequate lighting everywhere, so that when people, especially those folks that don't have the 9 to 5 or daylight savings time has made it so that it's dark at 3 wherever you live, making sure that you can get where you want to go in a comfortable way. I think, Candice, you mentioned earlier that with public transportation, even though less people were riding public transit, people were still getting jammed up because of the reduction of the number of people that they were allowing on buses. And so what you saw were a lot of people waiting at a bus stop together. We did a few things in Pittsburgh to try to make it a better experience. There was some analysis to see if we should relocate some bus stops, add some bus stops, make the physical space where the bus stop is more conducive to having a lot of people standing there. But if it is women who are disproportionately affected by some of these changes, then making sure that they are the most accessible places is what I would do. So that's not a single wish. Hopefully I get a few with my magic wand, but those would be the first major things that would make me more comfortable.
Yeah, I think just to amplify on some of Kim's points, when I remember back in the days when I roamed cities before COVID, I remember waiting at bus stops and being scared all the time because they were dark. There was no one there except for maybe one person who maybe made me feel uncomfortable or not. So I would say lighting and locating our stops where there are people. Because, you know, when you are in an empty space with no light, whether or not you are unsafe, you feel unsafe. And I think that's true for people beyond just women, but definitely true for women.
And regularized service. So if you know and really can depend on there being a vehicle every 15 minutes or 10 or 12, and that really works, then you're a lot less worried about being at that bus stop. So the regularity, and again, thinking about those sort of, you know, peaks turning into rolling hills, whether that means that we can change our transit system so that it has more regular service throughout the day, and can use those resources that way instead of to accommodate the peaks, which are essentially for you know, white collar people who work downtown, and that's a small part of the whole.
Can I add one more thing?
Oh, please.
You know, I talked a lot about the pedestrian environment, but I, you know, like to ride my bike, and that would be my preferred way of getting around, even with my child. But I am afraid of a car. You know, I've been over the hood of a car before when I was riding my bike years ago, and I don't want to do it again. And so if I really had a magic wand, it would be adding a speed governor probably, and some sort of thing that prevented you from using your cell phone while you were operating a motor vehicle, or having the vehicle with so much assistance that it would not hit a person. And I know that sounds, it's unfortunate that that seems like it's such an unattainable future, but that's where we have to be, because getting across the street isn't just, you know, can you physically get onto the street to do it as a pedestrian, or can you get on your bike and go? It's how safe the rest of the environment is that you're participating in. You can try to make dedicated spaces where you have a protected bike lane next to a lane that has cars in it. But in a city like Pittsburgh, especially, where we're an old city, we have very narrow roadways. We have to share that space. We do not have enough space for dedicated, protected facilities for every individual unique user type. And so making it so that the motorists are operating in those spaces in a way that makes everybody feel comfortable would also be a wish.
Yeah,
Yes,
I'll build
ahead.
on that just a little bit in terms of, you know, we, like when we talk about micromobility, we often talk about the ways in which we can intervene on that vehicle type. And those things are great, but I think a lot of it is, even if you can't have, you know, separated bike lanes, it's paving the roads well and making sure there's not a lot of potholes. It's reducing the speed of the automobiles that are driving. So I think it's really distributing out all of these things, that there are actions for both the public and private sector to make to kind of get to that end goal.
Yes, this is a terrific group of fairy godmothers waving magic wands. I would change the streets to make narrower lanes where people are more likely to drive their cars slowly, and distribute that space to some other modes as well. And I would have lots of trees. There were a couple of really interesting studies last year. One showed that pedestrians overestimated the amount of time that it would take to walk somewhere, and that was diminished if it was a pleasant place with a lot of trees. And the other study was about car drivers underestimating the amount of time that it took to get someplace by car, because they didn't think so much about you know, like having to park it and all. So in cars, we underestimate how long it takes, and walking, we overestimate how long it takes. And we want to turn that on its head, so that we can have more active transportation, more kind of community spaces and streets that are a lot easier to cross. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time. I want to give each of our panelists a chance to sum up, or you know, wave their magic wand again, or do as you like. Why don't we start with you, Kim?
I know that I've been a little scatterbrained because this is such a huge topic, but I think what it boils down to is that it doesn't even have to be women versus men. It needs to be humans and putting the needs of human beings ahead of the needs of maybe automobiles or other uses. Because so many of the things that we talked about are not things that uniquely affect people who identify as women. It really would benefit everybody. It's just that because of the way folks have been socialized or because of the underrepresentation in certain spaces, that these needs that really would benefit all people haven't had a chance to get the spotlight. So I hope that, this doesn't end with a conversation at a conference during Women's Month, but it's something that most places have identified, more representation being better. And on the magic wand thing, I've really opened up my magic wand box here, and public restrooms, again, human needs. That's not a transportation requirement, but a public restroom, that's one thing that I noticed about Pittsburgh compared to some other cities, and this could be a whole session on itself. In the summertime, there were porta potties that were put out at a lot of park and public spaces. You would never see that probably in DC or San Francisco or in places where those porta potties might be subject to questionable uses. But it was a huge benefit to a very pregnant woman, and I'm sure lots of people, to have a public restroom available. And that's something that we don't talk about as often. But if you're talking about public spaces and you're talking about things for people, then you have to talk about not only how they get to and from, but also how we can use our public space to better serve needs in those locations.
Marla?
I think that my concluding magic wand would be that, we've talked about so much in this panel, but I think we've also talked about a lot of opportunities that have been created by this unique moment in the pandemic. So I think I'd want us to make sure we're using this moment to the best of our ability and build out as much infrastructure to meet these needs as possible, change policies as much as possible, and create that space for thinking about transportation in a human-centric way rather than in a technology-centric way.
Candice?
So I think I want to bring down everyone to the ground, because I think a lot of story and conversation we're sharing here, most women share the similar story and similar concern. And most men were simply shocked and unaware of this situation we face when they hear it. So I think to start, it's very important just to realize the gap and correct this massive information disparity. And by sharing more and stand together, by having this conversation together, even by inviting more men into this conversation, I think that would be a very great start to have the change happen.
So yes, we do want to have men be part of this conversation, but I thank you all for participating and giving your views. I would add one more thing to public spaces, and that is drinking fountains rather than plastic bottles. But there we go. All right, thank you all.